watching.
I have all of these questions, and then
I'm going live, and then as usual, I'll leave you the power, Brandon, when I.
Oh God. Okay.
The power.
Why he gives me the power every time, and I hate it.
There we are. I see us.
Oh no.
Live. Thank you, Marco.
Thanks, Marco.
No problem. Have fun, and I will enjoy what's coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will. There we go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marie Bilodeau. I am an author, professional storyteller, and co-chair of CanCon. Thank you for coming this evening. We have an amazing evening planned with an interview of Annalee Newitz by Brendan Crilly. They will get the chance to introduce themselves shortly, and we get the chance to be kind of in a little like holding area before we come live. And let me tell you, this is going to be great. So we're glad you're here. I'm excited. I'm only here to tell you about our next event so that you can mark it on your calendar right away. I'm going to tease you. We're going to take out all of the details early next week. Maybe by end of week, we'll see how we feel. So mark your calendars now for Saturday, March 27th at 3 p.m. for the panel, which, just to give you an idea of the genesis of the panel, we were driving to Confusion. I believe Brandon was in the car, and maybe Derek Kunkskin was in the car, and Phoebe Barton was in the car. It was some combination of that. And we're driving from Ottawa to Detroit, and Phoebe in the back. Phoebe is an amazing writer and also a game writer. She has a game right now with Choice of Games, and about like public trains, you can't go wrong. And Phoebe just mutters something along the lines of, you know, if we were in a space habitat, people would have to have some kind of like fighting or something to get rid of their excess energy. And I think about space habitats a lot. And that struck me as very interesting and quirky, which is very good way of defining Phoebe, by the way. And the panel that's coming to your way then on March 27th is Let's Build a Space Habitat. So we've brought on some experts who will discuss with you what they think would be a great space habitat. They're going to play off of each other. We have scientists. We have, I'm trying to look quickly here without ruining the whole fun, aerospace engineer, biologists, we have neuroscience. We have Phoebe herself will be moderating. It's going to be a good time. So come and join us, and you can ask some questions as well if you're building your own space habitat, probably in fiction, unless you are billionaires. And good for you if you are. CanCon takes sponsorships. So with that note, thank you all so much for coming. I will be hanging out with you in the chat. I will leave the floor to Brandon and to Annalee, and thank you so much for being here. This is going to be great. Bye.
Thank you, Marie.
Thank you.
I was just thinking, if there are billionaires watching this thing, they are not anteing up. I'm like, come on, billionaires.
Yeah.
Right?
Where is our space habitat?
Yeah. Holy crap, people.
You keep ringing the bell, my friends.
Oh, man. Okay. Thank you, everybody. As Marie said, thank you for coming. We are here for Four Lost Cities in conversation with Annalee Newitz, discussing this incredibly fabulous book, which I can't actually see if I'm holding it up properly, but it's there.
It's looking good.
Excellent. I had the great pleasure of reading ahead of time, like ahead of its release, and it is such a good book. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brandon Crilly. I'm one of the programming people for CanCon, author of science fiction and fantasy as well, and a reviewer and a podcaster and a teacher and probably a bunch of other things that I'm forgetting because I'm busy all the time and very tired, as those of you who know me know. But I'm not the reason why you're here. The reason why you're here is for Annalee. And we were gabbing before we went live, Annalee, and I forgot to ask if you would like to introduce yourself or if you want me to introduce you.
Either way.
Perfect. I will allow you to introduce yourself. I totally should have asked you this before we went live, and
Right.
that's my bad.
Hi, I'm Annalee Newitz. And for some reason, when I waved, I sort of flung my hand strangely. I am a science journalist and a science fiction writer. My most recent book, as we already mentioned, is Four Lost Cities. I'm also the author of Autonomous, a novel, and Future of Another Timeline, also a novel. And I contribute to the New York Times as an op-ed writer. I write for New Scientist. I write for lots of publications with science in the title. And I'm also a podcaster. And some people know me from the distant past as the person who founded a website called IO9.
I always forget until somebody mentions it. I'm like, oh yeah, right, they found
Yeah, it's
909.
like it's really like at this point it is like the Jurassic age of the internet. It's like,
yeah.
you know, at one time people were like, blogs, will they destroy us all? And now it's like, wait, we've discovered email again. Substack may destroy us all. And it's like, whatever. Next
Yeah,
it'll
like
be
yeah. Now it's
something
TikTok. That's the thing I think is going to destroy us all, but that's because I'm old, apparently.
yeah, I think it'll unite us all.
Really, TikTok is
dances.
is the positive force that the internet needs.
Could be. You never know.
I'm down. So like I said, we're gonna chat, and like I said, I've got some questions prepared, but we'll just kind of go back and forth, and I'll I tend to do these very informally. But for those of you that are here in the audience, if you have any questions of your own for Annalee, either about 4 Lost Cities or what have you, feel free to type in the chat. We have a very complex technical system by which our chat moderator, Cortni Fernandez, will fire those questions to me. It is incredibly technical and incredibly powerful, and I will not reveal its secrets. But those questions will come to me, and then I'll throw those to Annalee near the end of our time here. But to start off, I've been kind of paying attention to your schedule online and what you've been doing online since the book came out, Annalee, and you've been doing a lot of these freaking events. So like,
I have been, although I was going to say, I was looking forward to this so much because this is the first time that I've been talking to an audience of science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction fans.
Really?
And so, yeah, I mean, obviously not in my life.
Well, no, I figured that. Yeah.
In my life, that is my home. But in terms of like talking about this book, because it's a nonfiction book, it's a work of science journalism. And I've been just dying to talk about like all of the spec fic implications of this. So this is my first genre discussion of this non-genre book.
Oh, this okay. So let's start with that. What to you is the, like, if you had to pick one greatest like spec fic implication, what do you think it is? Because I think there's a bunch, right? Like,
yeah, there is a ton. And you know, I mean, part of it, I think the biggest thing for me was I used a lot of my world building skills from writing fiction to make this book come to life. I'd never, the last time I wrote a nonfiction science book, I had never written a novel before. So I didn't have those kind of narrative tricks up my sleeve. I mean, I had tried to do some fiction writing, but I wasn't kind of immersed in it the way I am now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really learned working on this book was that as complicated as you think a civilization is, it's so much more complicated.
Nice.
And that's because you know, the civilizations that I talk about in this book, they're all major civilizations that really tried to spread their culture out throughout a wide area, whether through just horrific military imperialism or through exploration or just through trade. And so these were cultures that touched many, many other cultures and were influenced by other cultures. So there's that complexity. But then the complexity I was totally not prepared for and hadn't been thinking about at all was that each of these historical civilizations had their own history too, that they were thinking about all the time and obsessing over and fetishizing and recycling and were bringing into their rhetoric and were bringing into their art. And we have evidence of these civilizations that we explore as archaeologists. I mean, not that I do, but that archaeologists from our people explore. But they also had people in their civilizations who were the equivalent of archaeologists who dug things up from the past and recirculated them. And so they wouldn't have used the term archaeologist, obviously, but so that really blew me away. Like I mean, it's so obvious now that I'm saying it to you and I'm like, okay, well, duh, probably everybody knew this, but like every civilization is, even if it's in history, has its history. And that I think it's sometimes easy to forget when you're doing that in science fiction, when you're building a world, to remember how much that world's history is part of its present. Like people think a lot about like the spirituality and how spiritual stuff influences, but it's not just spirituality, it's actual historical. So I guess that's my extremely large and lesson, my general lesson.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you there. Like, because I find, and I think as you were saying this, I'm like, yeah, I've totally done that in my own writing. Like, we focus so much on, I need to create this world as it is right now, that it almost becomes like, I don't know if monolithic is the right word, but it becomes this kind of static entity, and we don't think about in either direction, like that is comparable to say a civilization in our world, like you were saying.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, how the thing that to me was, like I said, so interesting was thinking about how much, like one of the cities that I talk about in my book is an indigenous city called Cahokia. And we know that later in the city's life, people were digging up projectile points from the woodland peoples who were who had villages in the area, and then the Cahokians came and kind of built their city on top of these villages. So they were digging up artifacts from a previous indigenous group and treasuring them and like sharing them and using, and like not using them as projectile points, but like using them kind of as artifacts, like as ritual objects. And that I was just like, of course they did that. Like obviously they did that. They were people, but I just never seen concrete evidence of that just in front of me. And I was in a collection in Illinois, where the Illinois archaeological group, like the state has an archaeological group. They just have this collection of all these projectile points, and they're like, yeah, here's one that's not even from Cahokia. just from the people. The people at Cahokia dug it up from the previous group. So yeah, it was super awesome. And like I said, seems obvious in retrospect.
I think you're right, but it's easy to forget things like that. Like unfortunately. I want to go back to like something that you were saying a few minutes ago about spec fic. Like, do you think, like obviously, like our science fiction and fantasy today, I think is doing a lot better in terms of the stories that are being told and the stories that are being published in a lot of different ways. In terms of like what you've been reading, we'll say over the past 10 years or whatever, are we doing better at recognizing that complexity of society? Like have you seen that improvement as well, or are we still kind of, I don't want to say making the same mistakes, because that undersells it a little bit, but are we still missing a piece of our world building that maybe we could be doing better?
I mean, I think some things are changing for sure. And certainly, because of movements like Own Voices.
Right, absolutely.
I think just allowing our own cultural complexities to be reflected in the books that are being published, that I think just automatically changes the baseline, where people no longer have the expectation that every world building exercise is going to be the same, or that every world is going to be the same. And I do think that, thanks to people like N.K. Jemisin, really reminding people, hey, when you build a planet, how the planet isn't just one group of people? It might be a diverse, and I think, Star Trek does this all the time. And a lot of us grew up with Star Trek, and it would be like, it's the planet of the listener people, it's the planet of the people who is this sort of monolithic culture. And, and there's the limitations of television, where it's really hard to be like, and here's a planet with like 12,000 cultures and 15,000 languages. But I think that, Jemisin and a lot of other are really trying now to give us planets that feel lived in, and not just planets, but worlds, like fairy worlds that feel lived in too, where it's not just the light fae versus the dark fae. Exactly. I love Lost Girls, but come on.
I'm with you. Like, and that's the thing. Like you're mentioning Star Trek. Like I love Star Trek for a number of reasons, and in terms of optimism, whatever. But like when you look at Star Trek now, you can see kind of the limitations of when it was made. And which is not to like, nobody should be shitting on Star Trek, but at the same time, like we can grow beyond Star Trek, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing, obviously the Star Trek franchise is changing a lot.
That too, yeah.
And Star Wars as well. Like I've been very impressed with how Star Wars as a franchise is really trying to, in some ways, in some kind of corners of the franchise, to reflect a more complicated story about characters' identities. And I think one of the things that for me was really exciting about The Mandalorian was the fact that we have all these different characters who identify as being Mandalorians, and they all have incredibly different relationships with the history and the culture, and have a different interpretation of what it means to be a Mandalorian. And that is awesome. Like I was like, and it felt really effortless. Like you could watch The Mandalorian just for the pew 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 and never pick up on that at all, and that's fine. Like you shouldn't have to. But if you're someone like me who's going to nerd out about that shit, it's great. Because it's wow, it really, I mean, it's not perfect, but it really does deliver in a lot of ways. So I think the fact that you have a mainstream hit like The Mandalorian that is trying to grapple with these issues a little bit, the complexity of identity and how politics affect the future and the past, is really, I think it's a good sign. I think we have a long ways to go, but there's now room to be telling these kinds of stories. Yeah.
And the thing that strikes me is like, we see, this complexity that's being discussed in The Mandalorian and these other, like, not new franchises, but new stories that are being told. Sure. But then what always kind of, the conflict that I have, and I think it's a conflict with my optimism, is that at the same time, I keep seeing like examples of how we like people still want to just stick things into boxes, right? Like we still haven't gotten rid of that yet. And one of the things I find interesting in Four Lost Cities is that like we talk about that a lot as well, right? That's kind of always been a thing. And we haven't really gotten rid of that yet. I don't know if that ever like weighs on you or affects your optimism as you're seeing these stories told, or.
It definitely, I have gotten a bit more pessimistic in some ways. I have
too a little bit, and it scares me.
Yeah, it scares me too, because I am a very I'm not a optimistic writer, but I do have hope, know, and my fiction especially is full of characters who have to maintain hope in the face of adversity, and that's something I really believe in. But I do think that when you look at like a broad chunk of history, like I did in this book, where I kind of go back 9,000 years, and you see people, just 9,000 years. The TARDIS, the one thing my publisher shelled out for was the TARDIS. And so when you see, like, so I'm only talking about 4 cities. Obviously, I researched a lot of other cities and in the process of doing this book, and I write a lot about archaeology in general. So I've kind of dipped my foot, or sometimes my entire head, into these other cultures which are, deep in the past. And we do see the same mistakes coming up again and again, and the same kind of like revelation moments of like, oh, maybe we shouldn't mistreat workers, like has to be kind of relearned again and again. And also, it's quite disheartening to see in each of the cities that I looked at, with one possible exception, that slave labor is really like the cornerstone of a lot of the development of urban life. And this is something that in the United States, people are still, I should say white people are still trying to wrap their minds around. There was just a few decades ago, the discovery in New York City of a burial ground from the 17th and 18th centuries for Africans who had been brought to New York, which was at that time just a tiny little place, brought there by the Dutch, and helped to build the city. And so even in this so-called modern metropolis in the North, where slavery was abolished much more quickly than in the South, it was built on the backs of African slaves, literally on their backs. And then they were buried underneath the city, and and that graveyard was forgotten for a long time, but now it's a monument. And so I think that is also one of the things that's really disheartening for me is realizing, and, one of the things I keep telling people when I talk about slavery in this book, because there are a lot of slaves in four lost cities, and I kind of talk about what their lives were like. And I say, well, there's slaves that are treated in really different ways in different places. Like some slave cultures had a lot of social mobility, like manumission was really common, and people who were former slaves could expect that their children might actually become quite important. And so they could kind of have this generational mobility. And yet it's still slavery. It's still coerced labor. And we're, we have that in the modern world too. We have all kinds of coerced labor, and, we might not call it slavery, but it's still kind of the same basic issue of people who have to work to live, who are being horribly abused and can't really do anything about it, because if they try to fight back, then the one small chance they have to survive, that tiny amount of money they're getting, will go away, and then that'll be even more of a dark future. So yeah, I think it's hopeful that we keep rediscovering that it's garbage to have slaves. I think it's hard though to realize that, we're probably going to have to learn that lesson again in 5,000 years.
Yeah. Okay, so you're looking far ahead. Is it like 5,000 years from now? Like I wanted to ask you, hopefully, right? Like I wanted to ask you, like there's this cycle in history of okay, things get better and then they regress, and then they get better and then they and I don't want to think of it as a cycle of regression, because even though that regression is always in there, right? And I think of it too in terms of the stories of women fighting for rights, say in Pompeii, and immigrants fighting for rights, and so on and so forth. Like we kind of, at least now, we're kind of rediscovering these stories that have always been there, and I don't want to think that 100 or 200 years from now we'll forget all those stories again, right? Do you how do you
in the future when Canada has been erased from history for being a tiny insignificant country?
How dare you?
Probably
how dare you, American? With everything that's set 3,000 years from now is set in New York City. This is where the conversation gets real.
Hey, I'm writing a novel right now that's set 50,000 years in the future, and it's the planet is the planet that's basically based on Saskatchewan. So
so is that
keep going?
What is that planet like? Okay, so is it all Saskatchewan?
I'm not going to talk anymore about that. So let's go back.
Come on, you can't drop that in there. What the hell?
Actually, I should say that that the novel I'm working on it was sort of strongly influenced by Four Lost Cities, and thinking about these long time scales, and thinking about I guess what I wanted to say is, before I get back to that novel, and I will talk about it a little bit, but I'm going to remember.
Don't think
that's cool. I just wanted to push back a little bit on that idea that history kind of goes in these cycles, because I think that's one of the kind of mental traps that we get into when we're thinking about history, because it doesn't seem like the evidence suggests that that's really what's going on, that there's because for two reasons. One is that it's very hard to measure progress. That's not a thing that you can kind of distill into a substance and measure it and be like, aha, I have 47% progress in this vial here. So that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to talk about whether history is progressing or not. The other thing is that, as we were just talking about, civilizations are very complex. And so while one civilization might be facing internal troubles and have political instability and have decaying infrastructure in their cities and towns, 3,000 miles away, you may have a civilization which is in full flower, very productive, very, making all kinds of new discoveries, however you define kind of a civilization in flower. And those two civilizations, the one that is allegedly on the downslide and the one that's on the upslide, they're going to be interacting. They're going to know about each other oftentimes. And the other thing, the final piece of that is that, when we think about progress, it's quite cliched to observe that, one person's progress is another person's backsliding. And so I think we're all moving into the future at exactly the same pace, and we're kind of going along, and things are changing, and there are themes. It's just like in a narrative, like the recurring theme that we have where where elites just keep abusing laborers again and again. It's just, it's the theme. It's if you were to do humanity : the series, it's like each week would be like, and this week, who did we screw over? Which group was screwing this group? And so
that's horrible, but you're right.
I'm like the Netflix series.
Okay, so we'll pitch that one as well.
So I think it's important ultimately when we look at history to remember that there are a lot of moving parts and many interconnections going on at any given time. And so there's really no, there are, what we can say are things like, there are periods where women have more rights, and there are periods where they have fewer. There's periods where slavery is abolished. There's periods where slavery is abolished in name only. There's periods where, you have more democratic representation for some people. And then, so there's, and different groups get their own moments to kind of accumulate wealth or accumulate possessions. So it's, I always say it's not utopia, it's not dystopia, it's just topia.
Just topia. Nice. I like that. If we focus kind of just on kind of the social elements that you were just listing off, given what we've seen historically, which what you're talking about with different parts of the world, being in different stages or different places, do you think the idea that some SF authors envision of universally across the planet, we've solved, for lack of a better word, or solved certain social problems, gotten rid of things like the separation between the elites taking advantage of workers, to use one specific example, do you think that's actually possible, or is that just totally pie in the sky, given that we've seen those problems constantly recur over thousands of years already?
Yeah, it's a super good question. I mean, I think anything's possible, obviously. One of the things that was so interesting about doing Four Lost Cities was that I realized in the process of writing it that, cities are a very new invention for humanity.
Yes.
They were very, very rare until really about 200 years ago. There just weren't that many cities in the world. And, so Homo sapiens, depending on how you define it, we've basically been around for about 200,000 years. And then before that, one of our super badass ancestors, Homo erectus, was around for at least a couple million years. And Homo erectus is cool because they invented fire, and stone tools. So we owe a lot to them. We did a lot with fire and stone tools. And so throughout all that time, so millions of years, we were roving in small bands, and we did not have cities. We didn't even have permanent settlements. We might have seasonal camps and things like that, and caves, really badass caves and stuff. But then around 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, we start building these permanent settlements. So this is just to say that a species that's been going along for a couple million years doing one thing can actually radically change the way they live.
Right. Okay.
And we did it. So, maybe that, some people would definitely say we changed it for the worse, but the point is that it is a permanent change so far, it seems like. It's been several thousand years and we keep doing the city thing. So if we could do that as a species, maybe we could do something to eliminate inequality. I don't know how we would do that.
Yeah, neither do I. That's the thing. Yeah.
There's a lot of really crackpot theories about how we could hack our minds to not have that kind of us them cognitive problem. And then there's also kind of the hypothesis that if we could just spread out onto enough planets, and had enough space, that we would kind of cool down a little bit. I one of the many reasons I love the show The Expanse is that they're basically
yeah, not happening.
that's not gonna help. No.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So I think we'll, our distant, like offspring will find out whether it can be done.
No kidding. Near the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but you talk about kind of obviously the future of cities and the future of urban development, and you almost sort of suggest that, or at least it seemed to me that you suggest that there's a shift away from urban environments that is almost unavoidable. That kind of 100,000 years of that we've been sedentary will not be forever. And like, do you think that's a definite thing? Like, is that, or would you predict that? I don't want to like pigeonhole you into saying yes, that's definitely going to happen, because I know it's not how we do this. But
right, yeah, I am not a wizard, no. So I don't have predictive powers.
But you do have a TARDIS. You just admitted to it.
I do, yeah. No, I wish that would be. No, I'd like to be the TARDIS. Like, I think that would really be like, that's like a life goal, is be the TARDIS.
I could think that, yeah.
Yeah, right.
But do you think the city thing is unavoidable? Like,
yeah,
unavoidable?
Okay. Yeah. So the question is, so basically one of the conclusions that that some archaeologists have come to when it comes to cities is that because cities do kind of grow and shrink, we see that again and again. Even cities that don't die do kind of grow and shrink all the time, except for Dublin, apparently.
Really?
Dublin's just been growing the whole time. I just learned that yesterday from an archaeologist. So, so every city except Dublin,
go Dublin,
grows and shrinks, and then some, of course, just shrink to the point where they become a village again, and they're no longer a city. So I think it is interesting that we're at a point in as a species where more people now live in cities than don't live in cities. So we've become a majority urban species. So it's almost as if huge parts of the planet have kind of come into cities, and their cities are all growing. And so I was speculating that it's possible that especially as the effects of climate change become more pronounced, and a lot of these cities become harder and harder to live in, and it's harder to maintain the infrastructure, that we might see a lot of urban abandonment. Yeah. And it might be that it's a more sustainable model to have cities be relatively rare the way they were for most of the past 10,000 years of building cities. Yeah. And also, to go back to those millions of years of humans and our ancestors being nomadic, maybe we'll start to see more nomadic, more acceptance for a more nomadic life as well. Yeah. I think there's lots and lots of science fiction that kind of predicts that as a dystopian thing. That,
I wanted to ask you that,
like a Mad Max kind of.
Yeah, which is not to knock Mad Max, but or specifically Fury Road, but there a lot of SF takes that idea of city collapse and seems to always paint it as a negative. It's something horrible has happened and we've lost our cities and now we're just kind of struggling to survive. Do you think like we're missing something as SF authors? Like, because I don't see it. Yeah, like I don't see a lot of SF. I can't think of any SF off the top of my head that takes city collapse and says, but everything's great.
I mean, I think there is a whole strand of kind of agrarian science, like of science fiction, that kind of embraces the idea of a utopia that's more environmentally sustainable.
Right, but it often seems to still be centered on cities. It's just, let's make the city more sustainable. It could have been, I haven't come across
and we
SF
do
that doesn't.
Yeah, and I think I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I think we see this a lot more in fantasy. Yeah. In fantasy, there's a lot of thinking about smaller settlements, villages, towns. The abandonment of cities is kind of a backdrop to just normal life. And I think here's something that here is a fact from my book that I think is very important. It is relevant to this, which is that when we think of cities, we often fall into a completely incorrect false binary, which is city versus country. Right. The fact is that the city is both the urban developed area and the countryside around it, where agriculture takes place. And of course, in our sort of multinational capitalist world, it's it's not even necessarily local farms that are feeding the city, right? Yeah. and bringing goods in. But a city cannot exist outside of the country. You can't. It's just that's part of the urban package is organized agriculture. So when we think about the future of cities, you could imagine a kind of inversion where instead of it being majority urban with all of these agrarian areas, it could be majority agrarian with a few urban areas. And people living in either small settlements or living seasonally in different areas.
Right.
And again, that doesn't have to be bad. Like,
exactly.
I love cities. I mean, I freaking would be super sad not to live in a city, but I'm a pretty weird person. And that's fine. You know what I mean? Like, that's what cities used to be, was just for like total weirdos that were like, I don't mind if it's stinky because I get to go to the movies or whatever, you know?
Exactly right.
I get to go see a puppet show or something.
Yeah.
But I don't think the majority of people really want to live in cities. I think people come to cities because of the economic mobility, you know, and those kinds of opportunities. But I think people forget that towns are kind of great. You know, it's not a bad thing. So I don't know. So this is my way of totally wussing out of making a prediction and just saying that it could happen.
For sure.
We could become Coruscant, I guess.
No, let's not
and
do
just
that.
be not. I want to know where the farm planet is actually that
Right?
feeds Coruscant. I always wondered that.
It's got to be something.
Yeah, farm planet.
It's out on the periphery, and we never hear about it because cares.
Everybody there is a slave.
Perfect.
So I mean that it is
Star
Wars. I mean the droids are all slaves. Like that's a whole other conversation.
That is a whole different thing. That's what you were just saying reminded me of. Not your most recent newsletter, but the one before that, where you were talking about kind of these cramped social conditions on the internet, and like you were kind of equating that to some of the cramped conditions in. I think you specifically Çatalhöyük, I think was what you were equating to, but I might be misremembering.
Yeah, I was talking about Neolithic cities. Which are
exactly.
Really early sort of Stone Age cities.
Where people just kind of got tired of each other, and which I find fascinating as a story. That let's all collect into this like honeycomb-esque city, and then eventually people are like, "Nah, this is dumb. I'm going to go and do my thing."
This is too crowded. It's a little smelly. It's hard to get home at night after farming. You know,
you got to crawl over other like homes and
climb up ladders.
No, it doesn't sound. I mean, it sounds cool. Like I was picturing it, and I'm like, this place sounds awesome. But it just from a visual standpoint, but in terms of living in it, sounds horrible. That is the thing that I'm really hoping that science fiction and fantasy writers can get out of this book is just like cool ideas for how to design a city, because these are real cities and they all had very different designs and very different ideas of what a city should do. And they were very successful. All of these cities were extremely successful, except, Pompeii did get snuffed out by a volcano. But that wasn't their fault. No, that's true. They didn't summon it down.
They were just...
And actually, Pompeii was neat because it was one of my neatest reads, because Pompeii was a city that I thought I knew a lot about. Like having studied history, and like I'm a history teacher myself, and I'm reading this, I'm like, I don't know any of this. So it's like it hasn't percolated down to the high school classroom, which is horrifying for a number of reasons. But just kind of this cool stuff about Pompeii that I'm like, how did I not know this? Why do not more people know this? That like about Pompeii trying to be saved and all that. Just these like, I always assumed that everybody just got wiped out and that was it.
Yeah, no, it turns out that only about 10% of the population actually was killed in the volcanic eruption, because in important documentaries about the events starring Kit Harington, review, like it sort of made to look like suddenly it exploded, but actually there had been earthquakes and the mountain was smoking for many, many hours before the final blast. And so people evacuated, and many, many people evacuated. So now we have, part of the reason why we don't learn about a lot of this stuff in school, a lot of the stuff in my book, even about a very familiar city like Pompeii, is that it's really only in the past few decades that archaeologists have been focusing on the lives of what are called non-elites, just people who aren't rich. And partly that was just pragmatism. I mean, it's much easier to study the elites because they had the biggest houses and that tended to be made of more durable materials. And oftentimes they were the people that got written about, if there is a written record, where they actually authored it. You know, they would say like, all right, people, write about how great I am. And so then we would hear about them. But now we have a lot of new ways of gathering data about people in these cities, and new ways of understanding sort of how people lived. So it's really become quite common for archaeologists to study just regular people, slaves, women, workers. And a lot of the people who escaped from Pompeii were slaves and former slaves. And so their lives are now being looked at afresh. And it's very, well, I shouldn't say afresh. Their lives are now being looked at.
Exactly. Finally, there's somebody paying attention to them.
And so it's really, that was for me, like one of the most exciting things, because I always like to write about regular people. I mean, I'm a regular person, so it's more relatable for me. So,
I hear that.
I am not the emperor of San Francisco, so.
Not yet.
Yeah, it's true. We have time.
No, I just that like, as I was going through this, and I was reading all these accounts, and like I was thinking about how we teach history, at least at the high school in Ontario, because like there's been a similar move at kind of my level where I teach, that to focus more on social history and focus more on everyday people, but it's still very limited. Like we don't like, I think I always worry that a lot of the like we're finding out new stuff about history every year, and it tends not to percolate down into the high school classroom, which is the only spot you're guaranteed that every student is going to find out about it, right? Okay, so like I'm not the only one who's worried about this by the expression on your face.
But
the thing is, I don't like, at the same time, I don't know how to fix that, and I really want to fix it, like to try to, because I think there's a disconnect between what goes on with archaeologists and in kind of like higher academia and what's going on in the everyday classroom. I don't know if it's time, or if it's like there's some sort of gap that needs to be bridged there, like to get this information out there. But maybe like I don't know what it is, and I'm not even sure that I have a question in that. I'm just kind of
well, I do know that, I mean, part of it is just the disconnect between people who are doing, you know, academic work and their audience is other academics, right? So they don't care about high school students. But I should say that since we were talking about Pompeii, there is a project that one of the archaeologists I talked to, Sophie Hay, she studies the lives of freed slaves. And one of the people that she studies is this fellow Amarantus, who I write about in the book, who owned a bar and had some very unusual imported wines in his possession at the time that the city was buried. And so Sophie is putting together a curriculum and a book about Amarantus and his world, which is aimed at K through 12. So she's thinking about that stuff, and there are, and I think that I don't want to misspeak, but I know that she's gotten a grant specifically to do that work. And so I think part of it is that we need more rewards for academics who want to do that. You know, we need to say, actually, this is something we'll pay you to do, or you'll get like professional credibility for doing it. Because there is also that kind of hierarchy of like, oh, well, if you're writing for high school students, it's just not important, dear.
Yes, exactly. How dare you?
You're not going to get tenure with that. So, which is really sad. And I think a lot of academics don't feel great about that. But I think, you know, there is some stuff that's changing in that way. There is some really great history being written now for younger kids, for like middle grade kids too.
Right. So. Okay, that's good. Yeah, because I mean, at the same time, like funding too is so important, right? Like I don't expect anybody to be doing this for free, and they shouldn't be, like, because this is important work, right? And like, so there needs to be more. We're getting a little like political here, but there needs to be more.
Yeah, but it is true. I mean, I think, I mean, this is something, I mean, it actually fits into our theme of thinking about like cities and civilizations and how they change. And education is so important to maintaining a city and to maintaining a civilization. Yeah. And one of the things that we see over and over in cities and the civilizations around them as they're growing and as they're attracting more people, because of course a city grows if you can make people excited about coming there. Oftentimes it is providing education or providing healthcare. At Angkor, which was the capital city of the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, one of their greatest kings, and by greatest I mean the dude who conquered the most territory, is this guy Jayavarman VII, who's nicknamed J7. And he's still celebrated today in Cambodia. And one of the things that he did was he built over 100 hospitals. And that was just part of, he just built it out of his own money, basically. I mean, out of his own wealth, I should say. They didn't really have money.
Right.
But that, and that's one of the reasons he was so celebrated. And so I think that we forget that like a great city isn't just like a super cool ziggurat. It's also healthcare and schools. And
like all these social
roads, like,
roads
stuff.
Are huge. Yeah.
Yeah. And, or well-maintained waterways and well-maintained sewer systems. Like you show me a city.
That was a big focus in here too.
Yeah. Sewers are so important.
Right?
Like, and obviously this is not something I need to tell folks in Canada, but like fresh water is really important. And having potable water is like having a government that gives you potable water. That's a sign of care and respect. And like that, and it has been a political issue in lots and lots of urban civilizations. And so if you ever want to think about like, how healthy is my city? One thing to think about is like, how well does the sewer system work? Does everyone have potable water who needs it? Who doesn't need potable water? But I guess what I mean is like, do they have access to potable water? I mean, you don't need it for every single thing that you do with water. And, those are like just basics, but they're not always, the government falls down on that and people start leaving.
Yeah, that's it. Well, we know, Canada's, say with Indigenous people for sure, like our history and our present day with that is not.
And same in the States as well.
I can imagine,
it's a little, we have other issues in the States. It's like all of our nations here don't have the perfect track record when it comes to
that's it, right?
Yeah,
I hear you. Okay, I'm conscious of our time, and I want to make sure that I get questions from the audience. So I do have a question from one of our audience members out there in the internet in this weird nebulous box space that we find ourselves in. And I think we talked about this a little bit off camera or off stream rather, but somebody in the chat wants to know how you decided what cities to feature in this book. Why did you settle on the 4 that you did?
So part of it was practical. It had to be places that I knew that I could get to relatively easily and that wouldn't be just astronomically expensive because I was doing this, I didn't get my book advance until much later in the process. So some of it was that, but more important was that I really wanted to have cities that represented very different urban traditions. So that meant cities that were in very different parts of the world, and also cities that were separated in time, so that we could get a sense of a very old city and a sense of more recent cities. Of course, when I say more recent cities, I mean, the most recent cities are still about 1,000 years old in the book.
Right.
But those are pretty recent.
In terms of like, I was going to say galactic scale, but that's not the right term at all.
But on the urban time scale.
Yes.
So in the book, you'll find that that each of these cities really does come out of a dramatically different tradition. And one of the things that I learned while writing the book was that, there's a whole urban tradition that comes from the global South that's probably older than the urban tradition that most of us in the West are taught about in school, like the great cities of Mesopotamia, like Uruk, that have the ziggurat and, pyramids and that kind of thing. That's obviously those cities are quite old and quite influential and magnificent. But also in Southeast Asia, in South America, we see lots of examples. And actually even in areas around like Papua New Guinea, we see like sort of proto-urban activities. We see proto-farming activities. And then, of course, we start to see cities emerge as well, like roughly around the same time that they're emerging in the West. And they just, because these cities were so different, they were built with perishable materials, they had different agricultural practices from the West, archaeologists didn't recognize them, and so they would say, well, I guess the West just invented cities, like, we're just so cool.
That sounds very Western.
It's very like white colonial attitude. And of course it was completely wrong. And so a big part of the book is sort of talking about this alternate urban history that has been neglected in the West.
Okay, cool. Would there, like, if money had been no limit, would there have been somewhere else that you would have gone? Would it have changed that a little bit?
I mean, sure. Like, if money was no limit, like, I would have
this is where we get back to that 12
like,
cities conversation from before.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, there are other cities that I am very interested in and that I would have loved to see and that I still hope to go see. So, stay tuned, I guess.
To for the eventual sequel.
I really want to go. The problem is some of the cities are just like, I really want to go to Samarkand because it was a super important city on the Silk Road, like back in like the 7th century. And it doesn't have a lot of stuff left from that time because it got sacked a bunch of times. I still want to go though. Samarkand is like one of the coolest cities ever. So look it up.
Nice. Is it just because of its presence on the Silk Road? Is that what you find fascinating about it, or?
Well, because it was on the Silk Road, it was incredibly cosmopolitan. It was one of the probably one of the biggest trading posts, and it wasn't just a trading post. I mean, it was a huge city, and it had this hybrid culture that was both Western and Eastern, and it was kind of a it had a lot of Zoroastrianism, and there was a culture there that was a group of people called the Sogdians. And the Sogdians, eventually kind of merged into other groups. They're just not around anymore, but they had a written language that was like the language of the Silk Road, Sogdian, for like 200 years. And it was just like Samarkand was like where it was at, and it was just sounded like it was. They had like a really interesting hybrid culture that just it's a culture that doesn't really exist anymore. So I would love to explore that more.
Very cool.
Yay, Samarkand.
Say yay, Samarkand. Noted. All right. I'm going to throw one more question at you while I wait to see if there's anything else from the audience, because I do not want to neglect our lovely audience. I had this in my head like half an hour ago, I think, but and going back to your newsletter. These cramped social conditions, whether it's physical cramped conditions or virtual cramped conditions, as the internet seems to be. I think that's kind of what you were talking about in your newsletter. Do you think there's a threshold or a limit where humanity can't be brought together anymore? Where like it is a time scale, or it's like a physical / virtual scale where it's like, okay, that's too much time spent together with all these people with different ideas mixing together, and that's it, we're done. Like is there a limit to that where like we're just going to fracture? And maybe it's I don't want to get back to cyclical because you made a really good point about that, but that sort of idea, like is there a limit to that, do you think?
I think one way to put it, instead of talking about cyclical change, you can just sort of talk about transformations.
Like, will there be
another transformation? So I know there's a lot of hypotheses out there from like anthropologists and cognitive scientists that there's like, that humans can only really know 50 people, and
I've read
like
that,
beyond 50. And I think, that seems kind of true on a common sense level, but it's very hard to keep track of people after, it's like why it's hard to watch Vampire Diaries because there's just so many characters or whatever.
Or Game of Thrones.
Or Game of Thrones, right? You like start to need the list in the front of the book and stuff. I don't actually think that there is some hard limit, because I think humans keep coming up with new ways to kind of organize ourselves. That's one of the things about cities that's so interesting, is that it really is a shift in social organization that allows groups of more than 50 to live together relatively harmoniously. I mean, obviously there's conflict all the time, but humans have conflict even in groups of 5, even groups of 2. So that's a kind of a social technology that we keep working on and keep changing. And so one of the things I was saying in my newsletter is I was talking about a hypothesis about cities during the Neolithic, so roughly 9,000 to 6,000 years ago. And what we see is that there's this weird statistical blip. Well, it's not a blip, it's a long kind of couple thousand years where people are building settlements that are bigger and bigger and bigger. And then sometime around 7,000 years ago, they start to shrink again.
Right.
So that's that moment of like people sort of scattering away from the cities. And then it takes a couple thousand years before people come back into even bigger cities, like cities that are just enormously bigger than the ones that had come before. So something happened in that time. People developed new social coping mechanisms, new ideas about humans, new ideas about culture that helped them live in these bigger places, in bigger agglomerations of people. So, and I mean, now we live in mega cities, right? Like, I mean, I don't, but like lots of people live in cities that have more than 15 million people in them. And, you know, I think we're in the process of developing the social mechanisms to deal with that, but we're not there yet. And that's why I think the internet, as we currently know it, like with social media, is having problems, because it's kind of like we've gone from living in cities of like 1 million or more people to living in a cyber space with a billion people, more than 1 billion people. And how do you kind of do that? We're trying to figure it out. Facebook is obviously wrong. It's the wrong way to do it. It's obvious. We're all kind of like, oh, okay, no. So what do we need something radically different. We need a new social mechanism. We're going to have to figure it out. Maybe it'll take us, maybe it really will take us a couple thousand years, which is like a super interesting thought experiment for you guys out there.
That's us.
To figure out.
I love I want to say it was for the New York Times, but correct me if I'm wrong. There was an article you did way back where you had Scalzi on there and you had a few other futurists.
That was for the Times.
It was for the Times. I love that article because it painted all these pictures of what social media might be down the line. Because it could be anything, right? Like, but something needs to change.
And one of the things that in that article, I did talk to a bunch of experts and futurists, as well as people who are working on the technology right now. And one of the things that almost everyone said was, we need slow media. Like,
that was the one that
just too fast, and that our brains are like just collapsing under the onslaught. And so I love that idea of slow media, whatever that means to people. I think we need to be thinking about how to slow our media down.
How absolutely.
We can enjoy it like gourmet food or something.
It's
like slow food, but media. Okay.
Exactly. As opposed to like, you know, the 100 or
fast media.
Fast media, because there's no health in that.
No. Just
exactly right. Okay, so we only got a couple minutes left. Unfortunately, you got to tell me about this book, the new one that you're working on. Because otherwise I'm going to
the last couple minutes, because I love CanCon, I will tell you guys.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Only what you're comfortable. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, and I don't have, it is a work in progress, that's for sure. Although I'm handing it in a couple months, so it's almost done. Cool. It's actually set in the same like timeline as the book Autonomous, but it's 50,000 years in the future. So like, it's none of the same characters. It's none of, you know, but there's definitely threads that are connecting the two times. It's actually about world building. It's called The Terraformers, and it's about the people who are terraforming this world. And kind of how they do it, and how ownership works, and when you're trying to build a world. And so it's because I had immersed myself so much in how cities get built and how different kinds of social organization produce very different kinds of urban designs. You know, a big part of the fun for me was just like, okay, how do I build a city? How do I build a nation? Like, how do people build like a civilization on this world that they're pretending is virgin land, but actually is a little bit more complicated than that.
That sounds awesome.
It's pretty fun.
So the
I'm
Terraforms,
enjoying
which
it.
will be out at some point.
It'll be out, I mean, sometime, I think it's next year in the fall. That's what
Oh,
I would
cool.
guess. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't quote me, but yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
our plan is.
Okay, yeah,
I'm handing it in a couple months and then,
that's awesome. Okay, I will keep my eyes peeled for that.
yeah, I'll let you guys know.
Perfect. Please do.
I'll send you one.
Awesome. Oh, that'd be perfect. That's excellent. So it is 8:00. And these
All
always go by too fast, unfortunately. But the book, if you folks in the audience don't already know, is Four Less Cities. Let's both hold up our copies. There you go. Four Less
Wait,
Cities.
I can't even. Okay, there it is.
No, you're good.
It has these stripes. The other
and
thing
I love how
wanna
the
say,
color matches on the side too. Sorry, go ahead.
people should just know that the book has these beautiful maps in it.
Oh my God, yes.
That were drawn by Jason Thompson, who does most of his work for Wizards of the Coast. So if you got a D&D feeling from the maps, that's why, because he does these amazing D&D maps. And I'm a huge fan of his D&D work. And so I was just like, make me some maps. And
oh my God, that's
they
amazing.
turned out amazing. So each city has its own map with like pictures of the art from the city. And like, it's really, he did a great job.
That's amazing. Jason Thompson from Wizards of the Coast. I am jealous. Holy crap. That's awesome.
He's just great. So anyway, so it has this
Yeah.
beautiful cover, but also beautiful maps.
Also
So
beautiful maps. No,
worth
all
investing in just for the maps.
Hell yeah. Go buy the book, people. That's what we're saying.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you for being here. This was amazing. Thank you to our audience as well for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I don't know, pay more attention to the complexity of your cities, I guess.
Sewers and water.
So much sewer all the time. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you again, Annalee. This was excellent. I have the power to stop the stream.